Why is it so difficult to reason with some people? Why are some people so closed-minded? Why is it that some people outright refuse to listen to reason, rejecting facts and evidence in favor of absurd or erroneous ideas? Jonathan Swift once said, "You can't reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into to begin with." Now, I don't fully agree with that statement, but I do think it offers a bit of insight into this question. I would say it's very difficult to reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into, but I wouldn't say it can't be done. I would also say that it depends on the individual. It depends on how long they've held a belief and how deeply that belief has penetrated. For many people, beliefs are very shallow. They don't have much depth or substance. They can be very weak and fragile. But as fragile as they may be, that doesn't always mean that they're easy to shatter. And this is because most people have a resistance to allowing their beliefs to be scrutinized. Most people will not put themselves in that position. And if they find themselves in that position, they will try to get away or simply refuse to listen. Depending on how deeply identified a person is with a belief, they might impulsively and automatically reject any information that refutes it, no matter how logical or factual the information might be. Sometimes a person will outright reject the evidence that is right in front of them in favor of a strongly held belief. But why is that? To the outsider, it seems not only illogical, but delusional. Because what the person might be rejecting is reality itself. And that is the very definition of delusional. What we're usually dealing with here is ideological possession, which is exactly what it sounds like. The person has essentially become possessed by an ideology, which can be philosophical or religious, political or cultural. And this happens because ideologies offer ready-made answers. They offer the illusion of meaning and certainty, two things that the human mind craves. But essentially, the person is no longer an independent, autonomous entity thinking for themselves. Rather, they've been taken over by the ideology, which doesn't require them to think, because it comes with a prefabricated framework of beliefs, opinions, and viewpoints. Ideological possession is like having your mind taken over by some sort of parasitic entity. The person basically becomes a host for the ideology. And the normal functions of the mind, such as analyzing, evaluating, and logical reasoning, are overridden by the ideology, which has its own set of scripted statements and responses. So when you talk to someone who is ideologically possessed, you're not really communicating with that individual person. You're communicating with that ideology through the individual. And if you ask them, what do you think about this or that? They'll give you a programmed response rather than expressing an idea that they arrived at all on their own. But oftentimes, the programming is very shallow. If you probe deeper and ask, why do you think that? Or worse, if you challenge that response with conflicting information, especially in the form of facts and evidence, they'll tend not to have a programmed response for that level of scrutiny. And this will often cause their brain to short circuit or freeze up. They can't process the contradiction because it doesn't fit the framework of the ideology. This is called cognitive dissonance. This is the discomfort we experience when incoming information conflicts with our existing beliefs. And instead of changing our beliefs to fit the facts, We simply reject the facts. And so people will tend to become agitated or angry when presented with conflicting information. Sometimes they may have an emotional outburst, or they might just shut down or walk away. In some extreme cases, they may even become violent. But what they tend not to do is listen to reason. But this isn't to say that a person is entirely beyond reach. It really depends on how deeply rooted the ideology is, how deeply identified they are with that ideology, and also how much the person depends on the ideology in order to feel a sense of validation and belonging. Now, in addition to ideological possession, some people will cling to an erroneous idea simply out of a false sense of certainty. Sometimes we can feel so certain about things that we haven't actually verified. We have a tendency to accept things based on the perception of authority or expertise without question, without sufficient evidence, sometimes with no evidence at all. Sometimes we blindly accept information simply because it fits with our current beliefs and biases. Sometimes we accept things as true, not because they are, but because we want them to be true. And this is how a lot of people wind up misinformed. But when you try to correct someone's perception, when you try to show them how they've been misled, most people don't want to hear it. Most people will refuse to listen. As Mark Twain once said, it's easier to fool someone than to convince someone that they've been fooled. And this is because we don't like to feel humiliated. We don't want to admit to having been fooled. To admit to being fooled is to admit to having been foolish. And no one wants to look foolish. And so a lot of times people will reject the truth simply to protect their ego. They'll even double down on some erroneous idea, even in the face of conflicting evidence, just to avoid having to admit that they were wrong. So all of this brings us back to the question of whether or not it's possible to reason someone out of a position that they didn't reason themselves into. And of course, the answer to that question depends on a number of factors. If we're dealing with someone who is simply afraid to admit to being wrong, the way to reach them would be to first assure them that it's okay to be wrong. We all get things wrong sometimes. And admitting when you're wrong shows courage and integrity. But if you're dealing with someone who is ideologically possessed, that's going to be much more challenging. Reasoning someone out of a belief which provides them with a sense of identity, as well as a sense of belonging, is going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it would have to be done very tactfully. Perhaps your best chance would be to use the Socratic method, which primarily involves asking questions. The Socratic method can potentially bypass a person's defenses because instead of telling them that they're wrong, you invite them to discover that for themselves. You would ask them questions that guide them toward discerning what is true and what is false and to reach their own conclusions. But with that being said, I think it also has to be understood that most people are simply not going to allow their beliefs to be scrutinized. As soon as you start to question a person's beliefs, they become deeply uncomfortable. And this is especially the case when the person is strongly identified with a belief, because any threat to that belief feels like a threat to that person's life. And so they will tend to become extremely defensive or try to get away. This is the main problem, that people tend to confuse beliefs with who they are. And so it's important for all of us to understand that beliefs are something we hold. Beliefs are something we adopt, something that we can exchange or discard. But who we are is not our beliefs. We are simply the one holding the beliefs. The problem is when we identify with our beliefs, when we create an identity based on what it is that we believe. This is one of the reasons why, for me personally, I don't like the idea of belonging to a religion or a political party. This is why I often avoid using labels to describe myself regarding my political or spiritual or philosophical beliefs. Because I am not my beliefs. I am the one holding these beliefs. And I'm willing to allow those beliefs to be challenged. I'm willing to change them in light of new information. And I'm willing to discard them entirely if they're proven to be false. And this might be the most important thing, that we recognize our own biases and ideological attachments, and that we try to have the same openness that we demand of others. That just as we have this desire for other people to be willing to change their minds, we should also have that willingness. Otherwise, we're no different than those we consider unreasonable. If you find value in this content, be sure to like, share, and subscribe.